Today's video is the final video in my series where I replace my fully UniFi home network with equipment from other brands. In previous videos, I've replaced my UniFi switches with Cisco business switches and my UDM Pro router with an OpenSense box. So the final thing we need to do is replace my UniFi NanoHD access point with a different AP. So yeah, I'm currently running a UniFi NanoHD access point and have been for many years. I think I got this around about 2019 and it's worked absolutely brilliantly. But I wanted to try something different. Picking a different brand of access point was relatively tricky because UniFi is very much the standard access point in the sort of small business, home user, even medium-sized, low-cost access point space. There's not many other viable competitors. In terms of my requirements, I wanted something that was Wi-Fi 6 capable and controller manageable. Now, I only have a single access point, so realistically with my current deployment, I could just get a standalone access point and use that. However, I wanted the ability to scale up my environment and add additional access points in the future, managed by a controller. I also like trying out equipment myself to then advise other people on, so I wanted to try out a system that I could advise to other people who may need multiple access points, so I wanted something that could be managed by a central controller. I also didn't want anything cloud managed, and this is where it got a little bit trickier to try and find viable options, because so many options nowadays are cloud managed. So that completely ruled out Aruba Instant On, it ruled out a lot of Ingenious products, it ruled out those Alta Labs ones that lots of other YouTubers are talking about at the moment. There's not that many affordable access point platforms that aren't cloud-based nowadays. Additionally, I wanted something that I could use without support contracts. So it completely ruled out the likes of Cisco's high-end options because I don't want to deal with support contracts or licensing individual access points and all that kind of stuff, but I still wanted the sort of enterprise high-end features. So, you may be wondering what I've gone for. And well, I'm going to Ruckus. So Ruckus is an option that I looked at way back when I was first moving to UniFi. This was back in 2015 when I first got a UniFi access point. I was looking at other options on the market. And Ruckus access points were very highly recommended, but back then they were a bit like Cisco in the sense that you could run them standalone but without a controller. But if you wanted to controller manage them, you needed to buy Ruckus's Zone Director hardware controllers, which had all sorts of licensing fees. They were very expensive appliances as well, so it wasn't really a viable option. However, since then, Ruckus has released a product called Ruckus Unleashed. In fact, they released it back in 2015, clearly just a few months after I was looking trying to evaluate options. And Ruckus Unleashed is absolutely perfect for my sort of deployment, and many small to medium-sized deployments. With Ruckus Unleashed, the access points themselves act as the controller. With Ruckus Unleashed, you can have a network of up to 128 access points. If you see some documentation mentioning lower limits of numbers of access points, this seems to have been increased throughout the lifespan of the product. So nowadays it's 128 access points, and one of those will be elected to act as a controller. That access point, you can log into its web interface, manage all your other access points, and all that configuration gets managed across them all. It's also got nice high availability features, so if you've got multiple access points, the configuration is replicated to them all, so if the access point that's currently designated as a controller fails, another access point will automatically switch over and become the controller. So it seems really powerful. There also isn't really any licensing fees. You can just download the firmware updates from Ruckus's website. You need to sign into an account, but you don't need to pay for anything. You just need to sign in, you can download the firmware. So it seems absolutely perfect for a small to medium-sized deployment. And the great thing with that is you get to use Ruckus's top-end, really high-quality access point hardware. Of course, for larger deployments or more complex deployments, Ruckus do still offer controller-based systems. You can now get their Smart Zone controller rather than the older Zone Directors, and that can either be a physical appliance or I think you can run it as a virtual machine as well. And that can manage much more access points in big environments with a lot more complicated features. I think it can work across different layer 3 networks, whereas Unleashed is limited to a single layer 3 domain. But I don't need that. Unleashed is absolutely fine. And then what's great with Ruckus Unleashed is it's not like you've got a specific set of limited access points with weaker hardware that run Unleashed compared to the full-size, full-power controller ones. The access points that run Ruckus Unleashed are identical to those that run the standard controller-managed firmware. In fact, when you're looking at buying a Ruckus access point, you'll see each model of access point listed as two different versions, the Unleashed version and the non-Unleashed version running the controller-managed firmware. You can also spot the difference in the model number. The Unleashed versions start with 9U1, and the ones that are not Unleashed and run the sort of standard controller-managed firmware start with 901. However, it's not like they're trying to price gouge you by charging lots extra for the Unleashed ones. Generally speaking, they're identically priced. And beyond that, They're even cross-flashable. So you don't have to buy the Unleashed access point to use Unleashed. At least this at the time of making this video. This may change in the future. But if you have a controller managed access point, you can flash that with the Unleashed firmware and run Unleashed on it. And likewise, if you have an Unleashed access point and you want to convert it over to a controller access point, say your deployment's growing and you need to move over to controllers, you can just go into Unleashed, flash the standalone controller firmware, and it'll run like that. So you can easily cross-flash them. In fact, when you see the back of this in the future in a minute and see the model number, this access point wasn't originally sold as an Unleashed access point. It was a standard controller managed one, and when I got it, it ran the controller managed firmware. But I was easily enough able to flash Unleashed onto it and run it as an Unleashed AP. So that's really nice as well. They're not tying you in and making you pay extra to use Unleashed and get away from the licensing costs of the controller. You pay the same for each AP and you can cross-flash them. So now let's take a look at what access point we have here. So here it is. If you look on the back, you'll see that this is a Ruckus R650. So this is one of Ruckus's higher, sort of mid to high-end access points. The way their model numbers seem to work is the first number indicates kind of how high-end in the range it is. So it starts off at the 300 series, then the 500 series, 600 series, 700 series, 800 series. And then the next two digits indicate the generation. So the 50 generation, as I'm calling it here, so the 650, 750, those APs, those are Wi-Fi 6. They've got a couple of now in the 60 generation, so the R7, the R560 and the R760, which are Wi-Fi 6E. I've not gone for them purely because they were too expensive. I got a good deal on the second hand. And realistically, for my needs, I'm in a pretty quiet RF environment. I don't really need Wi-Fi 6E, so Wi-Fi 6 is absolutely fine. So yeah, the 50 series are Wi-Fi 6. So yeah, the R650 is kind of positioned at the mid to high end level in their range. It has a 2x2 MIMO 2.4 GHz radio and a 4x4 MIMO 5 GHz radio. The R750 has a 4x4 2 GHz radio as well as the 5 GHz radio. And the R350, which is the lower end one, and the R550, which is also lower end, only have 2x2 MIMO radios. It's not as big a deal nowadays because it used to be a case that Intel Macs were 3x3 MIMO, so you could actually get a benefit over using a 4x4 MIMO access point over a 2x2 one. The modern ones are all 2x2 MIMO, so it's not a huge benefit, but I got this for a very good price, and it'll be good for concurrent users. In terms of pricing, these are very expensive access points. To buy this R650 new would be well over £1,000. You can still buy them new and they're over £1,000 new. Definitely not cheap, but you can pick them up reasonably cheap second hand. I picked this up on eBay, pretty good condition. There's a slight shiny patch in the front, but other than that, it's basically as new condition. I picked it up for I think £290, something like that, which is pretty cheap. They tend to go for a bit more than that, but you can get them for reasonably cheap if you buy them second hand. And the good thing with these is because there's no support contracts or vendor tie-ins or contract or anything like that, if you buy one second hand, you can easily wipe it, update the firmware, convert non-unleashed to unleashed and all that sort of stuff. They're easy enough to deal with second hand. So yeah, pick this up. We've got a pretty good deal on it. So now let's take a look at the hardware. So here we have the access point. I will admit it is not as attractive as a UniFi access point. It's a big sort of white rectangle, but it's not the worst thing in the world. It looks a bit nicer than their older ones. So you see on the top, you've got Ruckus logo there, sort of cut out there. It's an interesting shape. On the front, you've got a bunch of LEDs. So the 5 GHz and 2.4 GHz LEDs indicate whether that radio is enabled or not. And it also indicates whether clients are connected to that radio. So if it's orange, no client's connected to the radio. If it's green, there's a client connected to that radio. And if it's off, that radio is disabled. Air represents their sort of meshing. You can like mesh access points together. So I'm not going to be using that. CTL is for controller. On their older access points, that said DIR, which stood for director. Under Unleashed, that lights up if the access point is acting as the Unleashed controller. On their standard Smart Zone controllers, it's different, but yeah, on Unleashed, that'll light up if the access point is acting as the controller, and that's power LED. Pretty simple. Then around the back, this is all metal construction, feels really solid. Loads of heat sinking, so that'll be good for keeping it cool. Down here we can see the ports. So we have a 2.5 gig PoE Ethernet port. So this is the port you'll uplink it with, and it's nice that it's got 2.5 gig Ethernet just for that bit of additional bandwidth if you've got a lot of concurrent clients. You've then got a gigabit Ethernet port. I don't think this supports PoE, this is more like a sort of pass-through, so if you had this access point, you could technically connect another device off of this and give it a network connection. I very rarely see these actually used in practice, but it's nice to have that option. It could get you out of trouble in a pinch. You've also got a 48 volt DC input. If you didn't want to use PoE, you can power it over that, which may be useful in some situations. The final port down here is this USB port. This is for their IoT functionality, as they're calling it, because this access point is technically IoT enabled, in the sense it has built-in Zigbee and Bluetooth LE radios. Now, don't get too excited about that, because I was quite excited when I first saw it, because I've got a very large Zigbee setup here. While you can use that, it only works if you're using it with a Smart Zone controller with their IoT Manager add-on, and you're buying licenses for all the IoT type stuff. So it's not something I'm going to be using as a home user. I'll stick to my Zigbee to MQTT setup. But it does have that hardware built in, so if you were doing a large commercial deployment and you needed sort of very high-end Zigbee and Bluetooth LE radios, these access points do have that built in, but it doesn't really work under Unleashed. The USB port is for adding additional radios apparently, so I'm not aware of anything that really uses it. I think it's the sort of thing that they put in there just in case in the future someone needed to add additional radio protocols, you could stick a dongle in there and the firmware could support that, but that's all that's for, so I won't be using that. But yeah, it's pretty neat. The final thing to talk about is the mounting, which is the only thing on this AP I would say is maybe not as good as, say, UniFi. So in terms of mounting hardware on this AP, all you get is these two sort of keyhole slots on the back. And the idea is you put two screws into a surface like a ceiling or a wall and slot it on. My access point actually came with this on the back, which is for a ceiling tile grid. So it goes in there, clicks into place. And the idea is that you've got this sort of hook in here, this sort of hook assembly like you can see there. And if you've got a ceiling tile grid, you can then expand this out, slide this along, and clamp it onto the sort of metal bars that are part of a ceiling grid, which is really neat in the sense you could put this on a ceiling grid without having to drill into tiles, put back plates behind tiles to support the weight. It's quite a smart idea. Obviously I won't be using that, but it's a nice idea that it has that, and I think they come with that. Now, I obviously won't be using that, so I need to take it off. And this is where I first got very confused, because I thought, well, there's a clip there, I'll lift that up and release it. I can't release it. It turns out these access points have a locking mechanism to hold the screws in place. If you were to buy these access points new, apparently they come with a tool in the box that would allow you to eject it, that you put into this hole here, but I obviously didn't get one. I initially tried shoving all sorts of paper clips and stuff in here, and it just wasn't working, I couldn't quite figure it out. And then eventually I shoved a SIM removal tool in, and it released the access point, and then the SIM removal tool came out bent. But actually having bent the SIM removal tool, it's now the perfect tool. So I think the actual channel for this hole is actually slightly curved. It's not a completely straight button to press. So if I take the SIM removal tool and I curve it this way, push it in, that will then release the plate. And you can see in this slot here, the locking mechanism, if I pull this out, you see it's got this little peg that goes over that will automatically lock onto any screw. And if I push the SIM removal tool in, that'll move out of the way. So if you did get a Ruckus access point and you couldn't remove it from the ceiling, or you didn't have the removal tool, you kind of need something that's bent a bit like that. I found actually just taking a SIM removal tool, shoving it in the hole, it then actually bent it to the correct shape, and now it works to take it out. But if you were having an issue, you kind of want to take a bit of thin, fairly sturdy metal, put a very slight curve in it, angle that curve to sort of this orientation in relation to the AP, push it in, and that works. So that's how you remove it from the ceiling. It does mean it's not as easy to take down as, say, a UniFi AP, which you can take down with a screwdriver, which in a home environment is a bit inconvenient, but in a more business or public environment, it's not a bad thing, because if you're sticking about £1,000 of kit to a ceiling in a public place, it's nice that people can't just rip it off the ceiling. Of course, it's not the hardest thing in the world to remove, but it's a bit harder than a screwdriver or just a clip. So I'm not as big a fan of this compared to having like a back plate. It's much nicer to be able to screw a back plate to the ceiling and click the AP onto it. But I'm sure it'll work fine. We'll figure out how we're going to mount it. And the one benefit is that it means you can't buy an access point like this and not have the appropriate mounting hardware. It's not like if you buy a UniFi access point and the mounting plate's missing and you literally can't mount it without the mounting plate. With this, all you need is two screws, so you can't really get one of these without the mounting hardware included, which is good. So yeah, that's the back of the access point there. And then the final thing to point out, you see the model number there, and as you can see on mine, it starts with 901, which indicates that this originally was a controller managed AP, not an Unleashed one, but I was able to flash it to Unleashed, so that was pretty easy to do. So I suppose the final thing we need to do before we install it is fire it up. So we have the access point here, network cable here, so we plug this into the back, into 2.5 gig Ethernet port. That'll power up over PoE. There you go, powered on over PoE. It'll get a network link later on once it's actually connected to the network, so we just let that boot up, and we'll see what happens once it's booted. Okay, so the access point's now booted up, the power LED is lit, The controller LED is lit because this is obviously the Unleashed master. The air LED is not lit because this isn't doing any sort of wireless uplink or meshing. And then the 2.4 GHz and 5 GHz LEDs are both orange because there's no clients connected. If I was to connect a client, those would turn green. So it's now working. So what I'll now do is I'll very quickly jump in and take a look at the Unleashed web interface. I won't go into too much detail because there's going to be much better videos out there of setting up Unleashed, and I'm going to be doing a future video showing a very interesting feature this supports where I'll be doing the configuration of that. But I'll take a quick look just to see what you're going to expect when you get into the Unleashed web interface. And once we've done that, we'll get this thing installed. Okay, so here we are in the Ruckus Unleashed web interface. So I've already logged into this and I've pulled it up, and here it is. So I'm not going to go into too much detail showing everything about configuring this. I'll just do a quick tour. So it's not overly complicated, it's not overly flashy, but it's very functional and it works. So in here you can manage all your Wi-Fi networks. So obviously I've got a couple here already created, you can create more. So this is where you can define the name of the network. Is it a guest network? Set up the encryption. Is it WPA2? Is it enterprise? You can go into here, there's additional settings around, say, setting up VLANs to put each network on a different VLAN, so you can do that here. So it's very, very powerful. So it's basically what you'd expect on a standard access point, really. Multiple SSIDs, multiple VLANs, not a problem. So then in here we can see we have two SSIDs that are already created. Ruckus Wireless 1, which is default, and Ruckus DPSK Test. Now DPSK is a really cool feature of Ruckus access points. Other vendors also support it. They tend to call it things like PPSK, different names. UniFi don't know, so hopefully they get that in the future because it's a really cool feature. And it stands for Dynamic Pre-Shared Key. What this means is that rather than having a single key for each SSID, you can have multiple keys associated with the same SSID. And you can use this in a few different ways. You can either use this for, say, guest access, where you have a bunch of single-use keys that are almost disposable. You give them out to someone, they can use it for a period of time, the key then expires and they can't connect to the network anymore. You can also have keys that are tied to a device, so as soon as you log into a device with that, connect using it from a single device using that key gets tied to the MAC address, and then no other device can use that key. Or you can use it for what I'm using it for, where you can use the key that's provided to define which VLAN the device is put on. In many ways, it's a similar idea to WPA2 Enterprise, where you'd have a Radius server, you'd log in with a username and password, and the Radius server will issue a VLAN to the device. And while that's great in a business environment, it doesn't really work in a home environment, because many things like smart home devices, games consoles, smart TVs, that sort of stuff, don't support WPA2 Enterprise. Whereas DPSK gets around that because, as far as the device is concerned, it's a standard WPA2 network. It just so happens that whatever key the device uses defines which VLAN it's put on. And this has a very good benefit. It means that I no longer need to have an SSID for every single VLAN. Because currently in my home network, I have three different SSIDs: LAN, guest, and IoT. So LAN's all my normal devices, guest is for guests, and IoT is for IoT devices. However, I'd quite like to add an additional one. So for my IoT, I have an IoT SSID for IoT devices that require internet access, and a separate one for IoT devices that don't require internet access. But with my current setup, that would mean a fourth SSID, and that's the limit of a single UniFi access point. If I wanted to, say, have an additional SSID for a camera or a particular type of device, that gets really clunky because you have too many SSIDs. With DPSK, on the other hand, I can have as many SSIDs or as many different VLANs as I could possibly want, all with their own key, with one SSID broadcasting, which is really smart. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video setting all that up. I'll be doing a future video demonstrating all this, but that's what it is here. We'll take a look at it working later, but that's what this DPSK test access point is. Next up, we have a section for clients. This is all the clients that are connected. I've only got one connected right now, and you can see it's my phone, and it's actually connected to the DPSK test access point, and it has this user column because it's using a DPSK, and that user is the user of that key, which is test VLAN 1000, which is the VLAN it's on, as you can see here. So DPSK is working. So this is where you can view a list of connected clients and their sort of signal strengths and stuff like that. It's not as slick as, say, UniFi, where you're going to get all the pretty graphs and all that kind of stuff and what each device is using, but for a practical Wi-Fi system, it's pretty good and it gives you all the information you need. Next up, you've got a list of access points. Currently I've got one, but obviously you can have additional access points in here. Through here you can do things like restart it and all that kind of stuff, but it's pretty simple. Here's where you've got all your access points. And you can either edit the settings here globally, so you can manage all the channels and stuff available across all access points, or you can go into a single access point, edit that, and manage all the settings of a single access point. There's a bunch of settings in here I've been playing with, so I'll reset all this before I do the final setup. But you can either define all the global settings or single access points, or define the global settings and then override some of them with a single access point, which is really slick. And there's some graphs here around different clients and stuff like that. Next up is a feature called Dedicated Master. This is something that I don't know that much about, and there's not that much information on. The Ruckus documentation can be a bit lacking sometimes. As far as I can tell, there's some very minor features that aren't available in Unleashed that were available under the Zone Director controllers. So apparently what you can do here is if you enable Dedicated Master, it will set up that one of your access points to work purely as a controller. It won't broadcast any networks. It'll just sit purely as a controller, and that unlocks some additional features. I found some information about the features online. It's things like if you want to have access points on different layer 3 subnets and they can all communicate over that. It's that kind of stuff. It's not something I'm going to be using. And additionally, it only works in the R750 and R850 access points, which are higher end access points, so I can't use this anyway. But it does have this feature if you need it. There's also a section here for managing switches. This is because you can technically enroll Ruckus ICX switches into Unleashed. I've taken a look at some demos of how this works. It's not like full switch management. You can view the switches, view the status, I think you can maybe reboot them remotely, and you can do things like export and re-import the config of a switch, so you can back it up and re-import it. But it's not that you can quickly go in here and click a switch and update a VLAN or anything like that, as far as I'm aware. You still need to manage that separately. So I suppose if you already had Ruckus ICX switches, or Brocade ICX switches, I think they used to be Brocade, now they're Ruckus, you could pull them into here and it would give you a nice little management layer. But it's not something I was going to go and explicitly buy these switches to use with this, because it didn't really give that much functionality. But you have that feature here if you wanted. Finally, we've got all the boring admin stuff where you can set up email settings for alerts, all that kind of stuff. There's things you can put in for SMS, either for alerting and monitoring, or I think for like guest access where you can text keys to verify and stuff like that. IP settings, all this boring stuff. The only other thing we'll point out in here is dynamic DPSK, so the DPSK stuff. This is where you can set up all your DPSK keys. This is a bit of a tricky, confusing interface to manage, which is why I'm going to do a dedicated video on it. But in here you can see all the different keys we have. So we have some keys that I've defined, some randomly generated keys, and then the VLANs that are associated with them. So we can see this key drops you on VLAN 1000, this key drops you on VLAN 1002, and so on. And you can see here, test key 1, VLAN 1000, I have one device currently connected to that. So this is where you set all that up, but we'll go into that in more detail in a future video because it's way too much to cover in this video. There's a bunch of stuff in here additionally about Wi-Fi calling to set that kind of stuff up. Hotspot services, there's various guest access portal things you can do, captive portal type stuff. I'm not going to go into all that, there'll be better videos on it. But I suppose all that's really left to say is, yep, this is the Ruckus Unleashed web interface, and it's pretty good. It's not the fanciest thing in the world, but it works. It's also worth mentioning that there is a CLI for Ruckus Unleashed. I have very briefly used this, so I'm not an expert, but it does work. So we can come into CLI, here we are, run enable to enable, then config, I think it puts me into config mode. There we go, and you've got a sort of, it's a standard-ish CLI, similar to many switches and routers and all that kind of stuff. So if we say WLAN Ruckus-wireless 1, that will load that configuration for that particular WLAN network up. If I put a different name in here that didn't exist already, it would create that network. So we're in here, we can run show, that shows all the settings. If we look up here, we can see the key for that, the passphrase is test pass 123. If I wanted to, I can change this. It's a really weird command that took me ages to figure out. So you run open WPA2 passphrase, new passphrase 123, encrypt, and then it's algorithm AES. That will change the key on that SSID. So if we run that there, we can then press type exit. That's changed the key for that network. So now if we come over to the web interface, we can go into this network here, edit that, show password. I think I might just refresh the page to see the new key that I've set. So we'll go into that, edit. There we go, new passphrase 123, or pass farce 123, I spelled that wrong. So yep, that you can use that if you want to run it over the CLI. It's there, I suppose. And so say if I do WLAN, new WLAN, do that there, exit, that's created a new network. And if we come into here and refresh this page, we should see a new SSID showing up. There we go. So that works. So you can use the CLI if you wanted to. I'll just delete that because it's probably unencrypted. But the web interface is fine. It is nice having it though, because if you did want to really learn this and become an expert in it, this could be quicker to manage it, and it gives you a lot of options for things like scripting. You've got a nice CLI here that you could definitely write a lot of scripting around and do a lot of automation, which is really cool. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but there is a CLI, and it seems as though you can do most things through the CLI, which is really good. So yeah, that's how you manage a Ruckus Unleashed access point. Obviously there's a lot more videos out there if you want to go into full detail on this and learn about it all, but yeah, it's pretty good. So what we now need to do is get this access point installed. Okay, so here we have my hallway access points. This is my UniFi NanoHD installed up here. So this is what we're replacing with a Ruckus AP. It's going to be a bit tricky to mount this. We'll take this down and see what we've got, but essentially this is mounted to a dry lining box behind it. But the way the screw holes line up on the Ruckus AP, they will kind of straddle that back box. They won't screw into it, but I also don't think there'll be enough space either side of the back box to get a screw in without cracking the plasterboard. So I might need to end up like filling in that hole and just completely fix the ceiling and just bring the cable through a small hole. We'll figure it out. So the next step is to get this AP down and see what we have behind it. So with the AP down, we can now see what we have behind it. So as I mentioned, we have the dry lining box installed in the ceiling, and then we have the UniFi access points mounting plate screwed to that. Because on this generation of UniFi AP, and I think the current ones as well, the mounting plate can screw perfectly onto back box, which is really neat. However, I don't think we'll be able to use this with the Ruckus, so we'll get that mounting plate off, see what we have, and try and figure it out. Okay, so with the mounting plate down, we can see what we're working with. So here we have the back box in the ceiling, we have the solid core Cat6 cable coming out the ceiling, and that terminates into a keystone jack, and then I have this small little patch lead that goes from the keystone jack to the access point. I did it this way when I did the original install, because I prefer terminating solid core cable into keystone jacks and faceplates, rather than directly into RJ45 connectors. Also, back when I did this original install, I wasn't nearly as confident when it came to terminating RJ45 connectors onto cables, so this was a much easier way of doing it. However, I'm not really going to be able to keep this solution, because I've drawn up a sort of template of the mounting holes in the bottom of the access point, and it'll be a bit hard to see, but if we hold this up to the ceiling next to the back box, you can maybe just about make out the screw holes that I've marked on there, and you can see that they're far enough apart that they straddle the back box, so they come on either side of it, but they're too close together in the sense that I couldn't really put a screw fixing here and a screw fixing here. They'd be so close to the edge of the back box that I can almost guarantee that as soon as I do that, the plasterboard would just crumble away and it wouldn't actually give a good fixing. So what I think I'll do is I'm just going to lose this back box, get it out the ceiling and fill this hole, and then I'll bring the cable out a small hole over here somewhere and just terminate it in an RJ45 connector. Because realistically, it's fine doing that. It's not going to be moving a lot. I don't like having RJ45 connectors terminate on structured cabling where it's moving around a lot, say at a switch where you're going to patch different cables in. But for this, it's going to be fairly fixed. It's barely going to move. And nowadays with like the two-part connectors with separate load bars and stuff, I'm pretty good at terminating them. So what I'll do is I'll bring this cable out a hole here, terminate an RJ45 on it to go into the access point, take out this back box, fill in this hole, and I'll be able to put two screw fixings up and mount the access point. And there's absolutely tons of spare cable here. I left a ridiculous amount, so there's plenty of spare cable to bring out this hole and give loads of space for terminating it and re-terminating it in the future if I have to redo that. So yeah, that's what we'll do here. So yep, get this access point out, bring this cable out a hole here, put a jack on the end, and fill in this hole in the ceiling so we can mount it. This is also going to solve a bit of a bugbear I've had for a while, because when I did the original install, I had a different access point and a different smoke alarm. So the older access point, which is a UniFi AP Pro, the original one, it sat further over slightly this way, and the old smoke alarm sat further towards the door, it sat further over this way. However, when I put in the Nano HD, it mounted perfectly central on the back box, and I fitted this smoke alarm, the way the cable entries lined up on it, it had to sit a bit further this way. So what that meant is the downlight was no longer centred between the two devices, and it looked a bit silly. So what I can do now is I've got the opportunity to mount the access point a little bit further this way, and hopefully get that gap a bit more centralised, the downlight a bit more centralised. Might not be perfect because I want to ideally hide this patched back box behind the access point, so I'll have the access point end here probably, but hopefully I'll be able to get it a little bit more centred, which would be good. So yeah, time to get all this sorted, and then we'll come back. Okay, so I've measured everything out, so I've now brought the cable out through a hole here, so I can easily enough terminate a jack on that, and I've sort of drilled this hole at a slight angle so I can easily slope the cable out nice and neatly and into the access point without having to make too tight bends in it. It's a little bit tricky with these access points to try and keep it neat, but hopefully that'll be fine. So what I need to do is patch this hole. I was going to do this off camera, but every time I've done things like this in network videos where I've cut holes and then patched them, people have always commented asking how I patch it, so thought I may as well demonstrate it. I am not a professional at doing this kind of stuff, so I may be doing this completely wrong. This is how I do it and how I've done it throughout the flat. So obviously we have the hole in the ceiling. We also need something to put in it, so I just have a piece of plasterboard. What I actually have done, anytime I've cut a hole out, like to put a back box in or something, I've just kept a little box of plasterboard offcuts, and these are really good for filling these sorts of things in. But just cut a piece of plasterboard down to the size of the hole, like that there, so that fits in pretty well. You also want it to be slightly smaller in the hole, you have a gap around the side that you'll fill, so we have that there. What I then do is I sand down the side of the hole, the edge of the hole, and the edge of the piece of plasterboard to kind of create a sort of 45-degree angle on it, so rather than being a completely flat right angle, instead it kind of curves, so I've not done that yet, so I'll do that next. Doing that helps kind of create a bit more of an area for the filler to fill into and grip on. And then all I need to do is cut down a little bit of a wooden batten, screw it across the inside of the hole, and screw the plasterboard to it. So I'll get on with this, and we'll come back when I've got a bit more progress. Okay, so I've now cut a wooden batten down to size and screwed it across the inside of the hole with a screw on either side. I've then sanded down the inside of the hole and sanded down the plasterboard plug that I'll be putting in place. So you can see if you look on the edge of that, you can see that it slopes now. I've basically done that. So that now means I can fill it much easier. So what we now need to do is screw this into the hole. You'll also notice on the front that I've drilled a couple of holes and countersunk them. That's for the screws, because obviously, as you can see here, we're going to be screwing into this plasterboard plug quite close to the edge, and I was worried I would crack it. So by drilling these pilot holes and countersinking them, it means you're not going to crack this piece when you screw it in. So what we now need to do is put that there, and get it screwed up into that batten. Okay, so that's plugged now screwed up into the hole. And as you can see, the key thing is that all the screw heads are sitting behind the surface. So these two are sitting into the countersink bits that I drilled out, and these two screws I've just done up tight enough that they've sort of gone into the plasterboard. So there's a dip around there that the filler can fill into it, so you won't see the screw holes. So all we now need to do is fill it. You could use all sorts of fillers for this. The stuff I use is this Everbuild One Strike filler, which is really good. It's very lightweight, thin stuff that's really easy to apply. It sands down really easily. It's not the most strong stuff in the world. You wouldn't want to, say, try and get a screw fixing into this once it's hardened. But it's great for things like this because it's super easy to apply, dries pretty quickly, really easy to sand. It's pretty good. So we'll put this round here, fill it all in, and then we'll be good to go. And that's the filler in. It's not the neatest job in the world, but what I find with that filler is that even though it says no sanding, no shrinking, it does shrink a little bit. So what I tend to do is I tend to fill it a little bit proud, so it sits proud of the surface, let it dry for quite a while. It says 30 minutes dry time. For this I'm talking you need to leave it like a week or so it's really, really hard. And then you can sand it down. It'll give a much better finish than trying to fill it flush with the surface and believe there are no shrinking claims, which don't seem to really work. So, yep, that's now all filled. So it's now ready to go. Now obviously in this video I'm not going to leave it a week to dry and then sand it before I put the access point up. That would be silly. I need this thing to be up, well, today ideally. So what I'm going to just do is I'm just going to mount the access point over this. The feet on the bottom will kind of keep it off all the wet filler, so it won't really be an issue. And then once it's all dry, I'll come back later after I've made this video and take the access point down and sand and repaint everything. But for now, I'll just get the access point up on this. Should be fine. So, yep, all we now need to do is get a connector put on the end of this cable and get the two fixing screws in, and then the AP can go up. Okay, so I've now got an RJ45 connector terminated on the end of the cable, and I've put the two screws in. The first screw I was able to put just through the plasterboard patch into the batten that I already put in, so that's just screwed straight into the wood, which is really easy. And this one I put into one of those self-drilling metal roll plugs. One of these kind of things here. This worked okay, but what I would say with these as a sort of bit of a tip is while they say they're self-drilling and you can technically just take a screwdriver, push it in and screw it in, if you do that it will very likely slide off to the side slightly, it won't go perfectly in the centre. So for something like this where you absolutely have to have it perfectly positioned, you can't have it even like a couple of millimetre off either way, drill a small, say 6mm pilot hole, 4mm pilot hole, something like that, because that would then allow you to, that then means this will go in dead centre and stay centred in the hole. So that's a little tip is, even though these say self-drilling, if you need it exactly positioned, drill a pilot hole first. I'm definitely not a fan of this method of mounting where you have to try and get two screws exactly positioned and slot it onto those keyhole slots. It works fine here where there's only one AP or maybe a couple of APs, but if you're doing a lot of these, this would be a bit of a problem. However, it does seem that Ruckus do actually sell special mounting plates for these access points, so you can buy the mounting plate separately, which is a metal plate you can then screw to the surface, with screws in all different positions, and then it has just two pegs that stick out spaced like these screws that you can then hook the AP onto. So for a small install like this, it's probably not worth the additional cost, but if you're doing a large install and installing a lot of access points, the cost of those brackets would probably be saved in terms of labour. It'd be so much quicker to mount those than to have to do all this with screws for every access point. So yeah, if you're doing a large install, consider getting those mounting plates. But yeah, that's all ready. So now we can test this cable out. So I've got my network cable tester I've made videos on previously. So if we plug that into there, we should see like that. It's all connected correctly. So we should be good to go. So all we now need to do is get the AP up, get the cable connected to it, and we can power it on. And there we are, that's the access point now installed. Looks pretty neat up there. As you can see, I've not done anything about the filler behind it. As I mentioned before, that filler, even though it says dry within 30 minutes, if you want to sand it down, I tend to leave it a good couple of weeks to get properly solid, otherwise you risk sanding it and clumps coming out. So I'll leave that a good couple of weeks, and then I'll take the access point down again, sand it all and paint it, but I won't do that in this video, I'll do that later. That's all now up there, and the cable's connected in the back. So what we now need to do is just plug it into the PoE switch and see if it powers up, and then test it out. Okay, so now I'm going to connect it into the switch, so take the cable, plug that in, and now hopefully, yeah, we can see there, the power LEDs come on red, that indicates it's starting up. So just give this a couple of minutes, it'll boot up, and I'll be able to use it. And there we go, that's all powered up and working. So as we can see, the LEDs will come on, so the power LED is on, indicating it's powered on. The controller LED is lit, which indicates it's the Unleashed master. There's only one access point here, so of course it would be. The air LED is not lit because I'm not using any sort of wireless uplink. And the 5 GHz and 2.4 GHz LEDs are both on. I've connected my phone to it, which has gone onto the 5 GHz radio, so that LED's turned green. And because there's nothing else on it, there's nothing using the 2.4 GHz radio, so it's lit up orange. But if I connect some 2.4 GHz devices, that'll turn green as well. So yeah, it's all working. So what I'll now do is I'll go away for a little while, play about with it, use it for a while, get some experience with it, then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so now it's all up and running, let's talk performance. Now these performance tests I did were just very quickly done myself, so don't read into them too much or treat them as absolute gospel as to how this access point performs. There's probably a lot of additional tuning I could do, and of course there's a lot of variables when it comes to Wi-Fi. So all I did was run a bunch of different iPerf tests and try out different configurations of channel width, and then move around the flat to sort of measure the performance at close distances and further distances from the access point. So to start off, we'll take a look at an 80 MHz channel width, which is kind of what you use in like a populated, busy, RF noisy area, and this is obviously at 5 GHz. With this, when I was close to the access point, I was able to download well in excess of 600 megabits a second and upload it close to 700 megabits a second. And when I was further from the access point, I could download and upload pretty easily in excess of 400 megabits a second, which is really good. Then to get the absolute maximum performance, you can increase the channel width to 160 MHz. This is a little bit tricky in RF dense areas because it uses so many channels that any interference on any of those channels will potentially start to cause issues. However, I'm quite lucky here that even though that I'm in a flat, it's a concrete building and it has like foil insulation between the walls. So while I do have a lot of additional networks showing up at 2.4 GHz, there is basically no other network showing up at 5 GHz. So the RF is actually quite clear around there, so I could actually probably run with a 160 MHz channel width quite easily. And with that, when I'm close to the access point, I can download and upload at almost 900 megabits a second, and I did see some parts of the test spiking well beyond 900 megabits a second, so that is ridiculously good. Moving further away, it dropped down to similar to the 80 MHz channel width, close to 400 odd megabits a second, but still really good. As a final test, I took a look at the 2.4 GHz performance, and this is obviously a 20 MHz channel width because it's 2.4 GHz. There's not many channels there. And with that, I was kind of getting, between 200 and 100 megabits a second generally. It was pretty basic, pretty average, but realistically nowadays, you're not using 2.4 GHz for performance. You're using 2.4 GHz for legacy devices or little smart home devices that don't support 5 GHz. Even with this single access point, the 5 GHz can extend throughout my entire flat, so basically I don't need to worry about the 2.4 GHz performance. And the 5 GHz Wi-Fi 6 performance is absolutely excellent. As a final demo, I thought I would demonstrate the DPSK functionality I've been talking about, because it's really cool. So what we have here is two different VLANs with two different DPSKs, VLAN 1000 and VLAN 1254. And then the keys are just VLAN 1000 exclamation mark and VLAN 1254 exclamation mark. Dead simple. And then each VLAN has a different subnet, so VLAN 1000 has a subnet with a 0 here, and VLAN 1254 has 254 here. Pretty simple. And then we have two different phones. So as you can see, both phones are connecting to the Ruckus DPSK demo SSID, so it's the same network on both phones. However, you can see the key on this phone is VLAN 1000 exclamation mark, and on this phone is VLAN 1254 exclamation mark. So what we'll do is we'll connect both these phones with these keys, check the IP address they get, and we'll see that this phone will get an IP on this subnet, and this phone will get an IP on this subnet. So let's connect them and see what happens. Connect, connect. So now with both those phones connected, we can now go into the network information on each of them. We can then view more. We can also see the link speed. You can see you're linked at 1.7 gigabit on this phone, so it's pretty quick. Then we can scroll down. We scroll down here. We'll see on this phone, which was VLAN 1000 if you remember, has an IP address 10.114.0.169. And on this phone, which is on VLAN 1254, 10.114.254.112. So as you can see, it's worked. This phone has an IP address on VLAN 1000, and this phone has an IP address on VLAN 1254, despite the fact they're both connected to the same SSID. So it works. This DPSK feature is so cool. So there you go. That's my new access point now installed, and I am very happy with it. Ruckus Unleashed seems extremely powerful, and the performance is absolutely excellent. And it's really nice just having the controller built into the access points, because in a lot of environments, if you're say putting in only UniFi access points but nothing else from UniFi, you still need to have some sort of server sitting somewhere running a VM that's running the controller, and it's not the lightest weight thing in the world. Whereas with Unleashed, you can just put your access points in and they'll manage themselves, which is really smart. Performance is absolutely excellent as well. Very happy with that. It's nice being finally on Wi-Fi 6 because it's a long overdue upgrade. And the DPSK functionality is absolutely excellent. I absolutely love it. It'll be interesting to see how it goes long term, if I'll ever hit any weird limitations or issues with it, but so far it seems really good. I've only had one weird edge case issue, which is where I was connecting my washing machine to it, which is a weird thing to do, connect your washing machine to Wi-Fi, I know. But it's a Samsung washing machine, and I was using the Samsung SmartThings app on my phone. My phone was already connected to the Wi-Fi network using the DPSK key for my regular LAN VLAN. So when I was going through the process to add the washing machine, the app was like, oh, do you want to connect to this network? Your phone's already connected to that network, so I'll just take the key that's saved in your phone and give it to the washing machine. And it didn't give me an option to change the key. So what that meant is that the only way to do that was to connect the phone to my LAN network, not the IoT network. So ultimately I was able to fix it. I just had to go in, remove the washing machine, make my phone forget the network, reconnect my phone using the IoT key, then go through the process, so that would give the washing machine the IoT key so it would connect to the IoT network, and then go back into the phone, forget the network, and rejoin it to the correct VLAN again. So I suppose you might hit weird edge cases like that because obviously it's such a new / uncommon technology. Stuff's not going to expect that kind of a network to work that way. But other than that, it seems to work really well. And it's so nice having that single SSID that now has VLANs for IoT with internet access, IoT without internet access, LAN and guest. And I can easily chuck even more VLANs on that if I've got a particular device that I need to have on a dedicated VLAN over Wi-Fi. I can do that all on a single SSID. It works really well. So yeah, as I keep saying, I'm very happy with it all. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you found this interesting, and stand by for a future video where we go dig into how you can actually configure DPSK. It's probably not super interesting if you're just watching these videos and not actually trying it and following along. But I found that there wasn't really that much information on configuring DPSK. The documentation was all quite vague. So I thought I'd put together a quick little video just to kind of show how I've configured it for my setup, because it might be useful for people setting this up themselves. So yeah, stand by for that. And also stand by for future videos. I've got an absolute ton of stuff coming up with a bunch of weird technical things and stuff like that. So definitely stay tuned for all that. But all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching.